Everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this very special discussion of race and policing as examined through the lens of HBO's Watchmen. Today's event is sponsored by the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, the Carr Center for Human Rights, the Center for Public Leadership, the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics, and the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. I'm Chris Robichaux, and I'm a senior lecturer in ethics and public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm going to be moderating today's discussion with three of the absolute best people in the entire world, dear friends, dear friends of mine. And so I want to introduce them now. So I'll start with Professor Leah Wright-Rigueur. She is associate professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Her research expertise includes 20th century United States political and social history and modern African American history, with an emphasis on race, political ideology, the American two-party system, the presidency, and civil rights. Leah, welcome. Next, Professor Chris LeBron. Chris LeBron is an associate professor of philosophy at Johns Hopkins University. He specializes in political philosophy, social theory, the philosophy of race, and democratic ethics. His most recent book, The Making of Black Lives Matter, A Brief History of an Idea, offers a brief intellectual history of the Black Lives Matter movement. Chris, welcome so much.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me.
And Diva Woodley, Professor Diva Woodley. Professor Woodley is an associate professor of politics at the New School. She's the author of The Politics of Common Sense, How Social Movements Use Public Discourse to Change Politics and Win Acceptance. Her research covers a variety of topics from media and communication to social movements, race and imagination, and political understandings of economics. Diva, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. All right, folks, so I'm going to just give a brief overview to our listeners to this panel discussion of how all of us here are approaching this, and then we're going to just take it away with our discussion. What I wanted to do is frame things in the following way. Pop culture in general is sometimes dismissed by people as not being worth engaging seriously. I mean, you've got folks like Bill Maher who seem to think that superhero stories in particular are just for kids. And, you know, he and others think that adults who engage them seriously need to grow up. I'm hoping I speak for all of us here today when I say I'm very happy not to have grown up. I believe that all of us on this panel share a commitment to using popular entertainment as one lens, not the only lens, but one lens through which to examine serious social and political issues. And it's in that spirit that today we're going to be unpacking HBO's excellent series, Watchmen, as a means of helping us think better about this very important moment when, through the efforts of Black Lives Matters and others, our country is finally starting to look anew and with a renewed seriousness the structural racism that permeates our culture and its institutions. So we're going to begin now, but I have to do one other thing, and that is officially, for the record, warning, 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 spoilers, you know, capital S spoilers. We are going to just assume you've seen the Watchmen series. HBO did offer it for free this past weekend, but we're gonna spoil the heck out of it in our discussion. So please, if you don't want to have that spoiled, please, you know, press pause, leave, watch it, and then come back and check this out. So with that said, let's begin. Lee, I'm going to start with you with a question. What I'm going to do is ask each one of you one question, and then we're just going to take it as we go along and take it from there. So Lee, I'm just going to start with you. Right from the beginning of Watchmen, we are given a graphic depiction of the Tulsa massacre of 1921. What's the significance of this event within the story? And what is the show challenging us to do as viewers by confronting us with this right out of the gate?
Sure. So I think, you know, one of the brilliant things about Watchmen, about the setting it during this time, but also setting it within the backdrop of Tulsa and the Tulsa race riots, is that it sets up from the beginning that this is going to be a show about race. It's going to be a show about race and violence, and it's going to be a show about race and, I think, the idea of the law and justice, right? And so in framing in that way, and framing it and setting it up in that way, it completely upends, I think, the larger trajectory that we have of both the Watchmen world, right? With the comic book series, the movie, and, you know, the showrunner and show creator has said that was his intention. But I think by setting it in Tulsa and saying that the centrality of this violent racial massacre that happens in 1921, right? 99-year anniversary right now. By setting it up there, saying you can't see the lens of anything that what happens in Watchmen without looking at it through this larger racial history. I also want to point out that for many people, people, for example, the people who are on this panel, we know the history of Tulsa. We knew that, right? That's not a surprise. But what was surprising, I think, for a lot of people was to take something like the Tulsa Race Massacre and insert it into popular culture history and then tie it to the origins of, essentially superheroes. And for a lot of people, that was brand new. It was brilliant, but it was brand new. And so it introduces another level of and layer to American history in ways that are deeply unexpected for most of the population. But for those of us who have the background, who have the knowledge, it was an unexpected twist as well, but one that makes a lot of sense in kind of the long run.
Thank you, Leah. Diva or Chris, did you want to jump in at all with that, with anything on Tulsa?
Yeah, I want to agree with Leah and also say that I think that not only about setting up this series, like you can't see anything or you can't understand anything in the story that's about to unfold without starting in this moment. I felt like the series was saying you can't understand anything about justice without starting in this moment. Full stop. And it creates it creates a really complicated moment to start in. I mean, the massacre itself and the evil of it is not complicated, but starting in this moment of, severe injustice, right? Genocidal injustice means that how we can understand the rest of the story about trying to achieve justice, we have to approach it in a really different way, in a way that's not abstract, in a way that starts from the trauma of lived experience.
Thank you, Diva. Chris, do you want to say a little bit about Tulsa?
With regard to the internal workings of the show, I think, Leah and Diva's comments are really spot on. I think from the point of view of a cinematic experience, also, there's something, I had a friend who was watching it last night and texted me and said, I feel like I'm being assaulted, right? I think there's something about that opening scene that is meant very explicitly to immerse you in terror, right, as best as you can. And this is one of the really powerful things about a visual medium. Like we could read about these things and that's one kind of power. We have oral traditions, it's a different kind of power, but for a mass audience to see very viscerally the directed hatred toward the population for no rational reason whatsoever, I think the show opened with that very purposefully, but also wanted to give us a sense of not only was it terror, but it was also inner lyricism, right? There's a mother at the piano, right, as this boy is watching possibly the future of racial justice with Bass Reeves on the screen, right, saying, there'll be no mob justice here today. So I think the show was doing this kind of external terror thing, and then internally, it was setting up an infrastructure for hope and beauty as Black folks are trying to look out for each other, take my child, right, try to protect what they could. And I think it wasn't doing it gratuitously. I think it was trying to show that these two things often exist side by side, and the pain of these moments is what lies in between these two things.
Thank you, Chris. And I've watched the show a couple of times, and I think we probably all have. And that opening episode doesn't get any easier to watch, for sure. I think that's, it doesn't get any easier to watch, even knowing what's coming. I'm going to bookend the series. So I wanted to start with Tulsa, and then I want us to fast forward to the end of this series. And Diva, I'm going to start this with you, but as usual, we're just going to go around. So, the series ends with this brutality, this unbelievable brutality. It ends with Angela's foot hovering right above a pool. And there's so much in that moment. And I'm sure that all of you, like me, when it just cuts and it starts doing credits, you scream at the screen a little bit. You can't end it here, but of course they can end it there. That's good television. But Diva, let me start with you on this. So this series does end by it at least inviting us, at least opening up the possibility to draw the conclusion that Angela Abar has gained Dr. Manhattan's powers, right? Yeah. And so what do we think the significance of this ending is, with a Black woman becoming a god? And to contextualize that, John Osterman, the original Dr. Manhattan, he was a decent man. We learned in the series he was a refugee from the Nazis, but it didn't take him long after gaining these powers to become a really bad person. Weapon of mass destruction. He's indifferent. He's complicit in the massive deception of people. Should we be optimistic with Angela or not? And what is the significance of Angela gaining Manhattan's powers?
Oh gosh, I have so much to say about this. At first, I have to say, yes, I think we should be optimistic. But the reason I think we should be optimistic is, okay, so let me start with Will Reeves, right? Once the original Dr. Manhattan has died and, Angela is at home with her grandfather, and she's like really sad, and her grandfather, who's played amazingly by Louis Gossett Jr., says, he was a good man and I'm sorry he's gone, but with all he could do, he could have done more, right? Like, which I thought was like an amazing eulogy for that version of Dr. Manhattan. But the thing that was wrong with Dr. Manhattan wasn't that he wasn't decent, it's that he had no purpose. And then that's why he couldn't be, he didn't have an internal guide. So he was pulled by all these external forces in ways that he came to regret or understood himself to regret. As things went on. But Angela is full of purpose. And not only is she full of purpose, she's full of love. And that is the difference that makes a difference. And I think it's really important. I think we don't always talk about this with Watchmen, but I think it's really important that a love story is the center of this work. My very favorite episode, even though this extraordinary being, the Hooded Justice episode, is a masterwork, my favorite episode is A God Walks Into a Bar, which is just pure pleasure. I mean, so, and there you learn why Manhattan chooses Angela and why Angela chooses Manhattan. And Manhattan chooses Angela in order to be redeemed, because he knows what's going to happen. Right? And he wants to live, and Angela can give him a life by taking away his sort of memory of his godhood, but he can also trust her purpose. And Angela chooses Manhattan because she wants family. And Manhattan can give her this family in the way that she needs to have it, right? Like in this non-traditional way, with the knowledge of what's to come, with a kind of, risk and safety rolled up all together. And so we kind of find out why they're bound together, and why Angela might be a good choice for godhood, in part because she would never ever seek it, right? She's not ambitious, right? She is protective, and she is she's not really self-righteous. She wants to make things right in as much as she can, but what she really wants to do is build a life, and that's also what Manhattan wants to do. And I think that's why having the Godhead in her portends better things than having it in the original Manhattan, or certainly Lady True, who's just pure ambition and narcissism, somebody you never want to be a god.
Leah, I know that you've been thinking about this as well. Thanks so much, Diva. Please jump in, Leah.
So I just want to point out that the show starts off with this horrific racial massacre, Tulsa racial massacre in excruciating detail, and then ends with a Black woman being God. I mean, that's profound. That is certainly profound. We could probably have a conversation about solely those two moments in and of itself. But I do think that it's saying something about this larger world of Watchmen, but also it's telling us something larger about narratives of justice and of a little bit of family and memory. So I completely agree with Diva's point. My favorite episode is also A God Walks Into a Bar. It is a beautiful episode, both beautifully told and particularly beautifully rendered in its examination of time and how time works and how it functions differently. I've just never seen anything like that done on television before. But also, I think one of the things that it does is it tells us a story about who Angela is and why she is deserving more broadly, why people are deserving. Because we have a lot of conversation in the show about things like, past wrong that's been done. Redfordations is a huge point in the show, which I found fascinating. But we also hear a lot about how trauma and memories travel through people's blood, right? That is a central component of the show. And in fact, you can't escape your past, or you can't escape who you are, right? So Angela actually comes from 3 generations of people who work in law enforcement or military. She can't escape the fact that Hooded Justice is her grandfather, even though she's not aware of it. And she can't really escape her that larger trajectory. So I think it's worth really thinking through some of those issues, and then thinking about that question that Diva brought up of purpose, and about how she has this sense of self. I mean, Angela, in a lot of respects, is the most, I was going to say the purest person, but she's not pure, and I don't think she makes apologies for that. But she's perhaps the most organic person on the show, because she is who she is, and she's just in her cause. And so we see a lot of building around that. So I think it is worth thinking about. And one thing that I'll point out, I actually love the way the show ends, because we know we're not getting a second season. So it's open to interpretation, but it's really not, because we see Angela walking on water. She is a god. A Black woman is God, and that's it. And the show ends, and we don't have to move on from that. We don't have to have speculative discussions about it, because it is what it is.
Thanks so much, Leah. Yeah, it really would be ridiculous if it turned out that like that. I'm just kidding, just kidding. Chris, did you want to speak to Angela's ascension to godhood?
Yeah, because I think I think there's also another layer to this, and that is Manhattan doesn't only seek Angela. I think it's really important. Manhattan becomes Black first, right? And then to be with Angela, and that was something that was just really kind of as the show went on. I got to the end, because Diva's point about Manhattan needs to be redeemed suggests something that links back to the idea of the police to a certain degree. And that is, this white man who has all this power in the world can only have purpose, right, by being with this Black woman and then inhabiting a Black body, right? And in the course of being with Angela, he is educated, even though he's no longer Manhattan, or he hasn't had a memory of being Manhattan, but he's educated on why Angela has that purpose that she has in the first place, through her near death at the hands of white supremacy. So the show's kind of meta thesis almost seems to suggest, right, that the redemption of the nation is by following the lead of Black folks working through trauma and confronting the nation with this trauma, and that in some senses the death of white supremacy, right, needs to come at the hand of institutional transformation through the police in the first place, right? But with Dr. Manhattan inhabiting a Black body and being with Angela, part of what seems to be happening in the show is a very basic idea of confronting, right, what white identity means and white masculinity in the first place, right? And that these white supremacists can only seem to survive if they take this Black man's power, right? But they can't take the Black man's power, right? It goes into a Black woman, right? And in the middle of all this are the police trying to readjust the scales of power, right? And so in some sense, the show puts white supremacy on its rear foot, trying to get a stronghold, but both institutions and the very trajectory of racial pain and trauma are working against white supremacy. So in a very odd way, the show has this hopeful thesis about the end of white supremacy, both through Angela's ascension, preceded by Manhattan becoming a Black man and their union, right? And his institution that we all associate with being an arm of white supremacy in many instances, turning against it, right? And these three things cohere into something of a hopeful story.
And Chris, just to follow up on this, I know we talked about this on the podcast a few months ago, which and for listeners, I have a podcast this week in Dystopia where we talk about these things. But it needs to be mentioned again, in part because a couple months ago feels like it was like a lifetime ago at this point. But the meta observation as well, that when in the show, Dr. Manhattan becomes a Black man, and then he's revealed as still being Dr. Manhattan, and they make the choice in the show not of casting a different actor, right, to play Manhattan, but of keeping the same actor. And you had some really insightful things to say. I hope you don't mind if I ask you to share some of those thoughts again. Yeah.
If I can remember it, maybe you did 2 months ago was a long time ago. But I think the idea links back to the very notion that the redemption, not to get too meta or too kind of ontological about these things, but there is something really significant about him entering into a Black body and then staying in a Black body as he becomes Manhattan. I think the show wants to give viewers a kind of visual symbolic cue that power can and does inhere in Black bodies as it does in white bodies as well, right? And again, just to really extend Diva's point, Manhattan does gain its purpose once he's in a Black body and he's had a certain kind of education, right? What's really notable is for a person who could see across time, and this is really, really interesting, a person who could see across all time at the same moment, he really can't gain that purpose until he makes the sacrifice of his own identity, right? I mean, why can't he just snap his fingers right now and save, right, and fix racial injustice? The show doesn't go that easy route. Manhattan must receive an education, and it must be in that body, right? And so him staying in that body, it would have, to put it differently, would have felt really cheap if he reverts to being a white man, because that's also a kind of affirmation of white liberal politics, which hasn't gotten us as far as we need to go, right? He has to stay ensconced, I think, in the identity of Blackness or to fully see his purpose. And I want to say one other thing, there's also a kind of side note here to Black patriarchy, because it's not as if Manhattan qua Black man saves the day, right? It's almost as if he's read Anna Julia Cooper and says, you're absolutely right. It's where the Black woman walks in, the right Black folks walk, she carries them with her, right? So there's also a kind of a slight side note against Black patriarchy here, in that he ultimately decides, even I can't do this myself. We need Angela to do this. And so there are so many cross-cutting themes about what it means for him to enter that body at the end of the show.
I have another thread to pull on, but I want to give Diva or Leah, if you have a chance, you want to respond to it. Diva, I see you. Am I reading you correctly? Do you want to jump in on this a little bit, or?
Yes, but Leah, if you want to go first, that's okay.
No, I was just going to toss out kind of more of a question or a thought. And I wanted to think a little bit about the 7th Cavalry making that decision. There's that whole episode where they talk about how they don't want to be white, they don't want to be Black, they want to be blue, right? That they are going to take the powers of a god, and that is how, they are going to get justice for white America, right? Mm-hmm. But then there's a very conscious decision, as Chris mentioned, by Dr. Manhattan after he awakens from his, from his coma, so to speak, his self-imposed coma, so to speak, where he chooses, even though he becomes blue, to remain in the aesthetic or the phenotype of a Black man. And I thought that was a really powerful way of linking kind of these questions about white supremacy, about what white identity politics values, versus Dr. Manhattan make a very conscious decision to remain in the body that Angela values, right? The one that, that Angela says, yeah, this body is one that I would choose, that would be nice, and that she feels with. And so there's a conscious decision making there where it feels a lot like Dr. Manhattan has left behind his old identity, whether it be, his old identity as a survivor, as a human, what have you, or as the Dr. Manhattan, the god, and chooses to be this Black man because this Black woman has saved him. So I think that is even, that's a really powerful indicator of what the show values. But turn it over to Diva. I know you were chomping at the bit.
Yeah, I mean, look, I read the show as a Black feminist text. It's probably because of what I'm writing right now, but honestly, when I rewatched it in preparation for this conversation, I was just like, this whole thing is just Black feminist theory. I don't know what to do. And the reason I say that is because first of all, they deal so deftly with gender and sexuality, I just have to say. The thing about Angela and what makes her a good leader for this project toward justice is because she's always checking for people, right? Like she's always, she wants to bring people along with her. Now she is ready to bring the thunder when it needs to be, right? She's not afraid to do violence or anything like that. But her instinct is to always check for people and bring them along. And I think that's part of what Manhattan, finds desirable about her. But I think that the thing that is so interesting about, Cal, Dr. Manhattan remaining Cal, I think it's because it's a story about transformation. And when you're transformed, you actually cannot go back, right? He wasn't mimicking, right, a being in a body, right? In order to live a life, he had to undergo, right, this 10-year period where he actually couldn't see in every direction. Because when you are in time in that way, you cannot have anything like a human life. And if you're embodied, there's kind of no point, right? To being able to see in those ways, especially if you have no particular purpose to anchor you to a particular time. But so he's transformed, right? His being is transformed in this way. And in the movement for Black Lives, there's this sort of dedication or something that people do in preparation for actions or just at meetings, and it's written by Mary Hooks of Southerners on New Ground, and it goes, what we're here to do is to be transformed in the service of the work, right? And I feel like that's what happened to Manhattan. He had to be transformed in the service of the work of justice. And that transformation did require him to inhabit the body that he inhabited in the relationship that he was in, but also to understand that it wasn't for him to be all powerful, right? That he wasn't, that patriarchy was not going to save the day. It couldn't, right? It had to have, this kind of politics of care embedded in it. And that's what Angela brings. At the same time that she brings strength, right? There's also so much vulnerability in who she is and what she is, and so much attention to care, throughout, even at the people that she's mad at, the fact that she invites her grandfather home at the end. And, she's always checking for people. And the fact she adopts the three children of her partner. We need to talk about that too. And the fact that those children are white, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
I mean,
I was just gonna jump in and say one more thing on something Diva highlighted, which is that we actually don't realize and we don't know that Cal is Dr. Manhattan until the very end of the show. And in fact, one of the brilliant things about how the show is rendered is that he's there in front of us for the entire show, right? I think Cal is actually featured in the first episode, but he's seen as, one of the things that the writers do is that they create this narrative around Cal where we know he's important, but we also say, well, he's a side character. And it's really interesting, just to bring it back to Diva's point, right? He's seen as almost like a house husband, a Black house husband, raising 3 white children. And we never stop to actually think, why is this character, who almost feels like a throwaway character, so central in so many of these scenes? And it's really not until the very end of the show that it becomes apparent, even though when you go back and watch, all the clues are there. Every single time the clue is there. And a part of me wonders if it's worth talking about how the writers very deftly took some of these assumptions about how Black men are both hyper visible and invisible within our larger society and within these larger conversations in order to, drop us on the head with this Dr. Manhattan surprise, right? So if we go back, for those of you who have watched the show already, when we go back, why wouldn't Cal be Dr. Manhattan, right? Well, of course he's Dr. Manhattan. It makes total sense. And they do a brilliant job of bringing that all together, but it's really just not, I think, obvious to the audience until the very end. So I just wanted to bring that up. And one other thing, because I think, Chris, you're going to move over to Q&A soon or soonish. I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about Looking Glass, who is one of the figures in the show who very early on is a white character who has this horrific traumatic experience as a teenager, or as a religious, essentially a religious part of a religious group, proselytizing, and gets caught in a terroristic act, but who understands what racism is and recognizes what racism is, but then ends up not inadvertently, but reluctantly helping the 7th Cavalry in their mission. And he's just a really fascinating character and kind of a pull together for a lot of these themes that are happening on with race and particularly with whiteness in the show.
Thank you, Leah. We have about 15 or 20 minutes before we'll turn to some questions and a few more items to discuss, but I love talking about Looking Glass too. I mean, he is a fascinating character. Chris or Diva, did you have any insight that you wanted to share about that character? We'll take up Leah's invitation, and then we'll look a little bit at Hood of Justice, and we'll look a little bit at what Watchmen is trying to tell us about policing.
Diva, would you like to take a crack first? Yeah, it's funny, really. I hadn't, I found Looking Glass to also be a really interesting character, but I hadn't quite thought about his role as a white man who gets it, but nonetheless gets co-opted all the same. And on the one hand, it seems like he has no choice, but on the other hand, of course, he has a choice, right? And I think what's interesting about Looking Glass is that we know what his beginning commitments are, and we know where he ultimately winds up on the side of, right? And so what it tends to be, and those two bookends, at least to me, rescue his character as a person who is and wants to be on the right side of things. And maybe I'm being overly generous towards him as a character, but I read that middle part where he's co-opted as exactly that, right? When you're born into as a white person in American society, right? What are the kind of various forms of entrapment that people encounter? And that's not to in any way exculpate what Looking Glass does, right? But I think his character, at least in my mind, was meant to complicate the idea of, right, what are the limits of wokeness, right? What happens when wokeness meets up against certain forms of co-optation, of being bought out or threatened in some ways. And of course, it happens in very dramatic fashion, right, in the show. But if we look at these in more mundane ways, right, what does it mean for white Americans, to feel as if, well, if I don't move into this neighborhood, my kids won't have a good education. That's not to excuse them any way at all, but it's a structure around them which makes it a little bit too easy, put it that way, to fall into the vices of anti-Blackness, right, and actions that result in anti-Black behavior. And I think in some ways, Looking Glass was a kind of dramatic encapsulation of that. But I think at the end, there's something to be said for him confronting Veidt, right? And Veidt is kind of like the ultimate symbolic fall of old stodgy white patriarchy, and Looking Glass is there for it, right? So I think he's a really interesting character. I appreciate you bringing it up in that way. I hadn't quite thought him through that way. But what do you think, Diva?
I agree with you. I agree with you both. I think that actually Looking Glass's opposite is Veidt, right? Like, so that Veidt is not only white patriarchy, but white liberal patriarchy, right? Is that Veidt really believes that he is doing the right thing, right? And that he is making the hard decisions and that he is doing trade-offs, but it's for the good of humanity, right? And don't question him, you should be grateful, right? Like, so, I mean, I think that is like perfectly tuned, right? But Veidt is also kind of self-aware, right? Like, he knows that he's not the good guy, even though he believes he's done what's necessary, right? Whereas Looking Glass is really going through a process. He's really wrestling with whiteness, right? In that episode where he betrays Angela, he asks her first, before he does it, is anything true, right? So he's really like coming up against whiteness and what it is, and sort of trying to figure out if he is, right, to quote James Baldwin, a person who believes he is white, right? Or a human being, right? Right, like something like this. So I thought that character was really fantastic and true. And that, he is not innocent, but he's willing to confront all of these things that others of the characters are not willing to confront. And it is through that he ends up where he needs to be, right? So his virtue is earned, I think. And I would say that for Laurie Blake as well, right? Like, she is also in that vein. And the last thing that they say to each other is, is that people can change, right? Some people can change, So I thought it was actually really an interesting culmination. And the fact that those characters go through that transformation, and we see it, and it's easy to empathize, but it's also not the central story, is so politically relevant, right? Like centering the people who are not always, who are not usually centered, right? Centering the marginalized is what the series does, and yet it treats these other characters who are on this journey, with just as much depthness and empathy, as they deserve, really.
Yeah. If I could jump with one more point, I think there's also the irony that insofar as any of the characters have powers, Looking Glass's power is to read people right down to the eye twitch. And the fact that his day job is, studying these focus groups, right? I mean, how mundane and mainstream could a person be than assessing what focus groups are doing, and the great weariness and wariness with which he does this job suggests that something internal to him thinks that humanity is both entirely predictable, a bit boring, but then in himself, right? Diva Lee, absolutely right. There's something to the journey about him. So I just thought that was also interesting, what he does for a living, right? As a backdrop to exactly who this character is and the journey that he goes on. There's a really interesting tension between those two things.
So this is amazing. Can we just do this all afternoon? I do want to try to get to at least two more things before we bring it to questions from folks. And Chris, I'm going to toss this your way just because I know that you like Batman. You're a Batman fan as well. And so, Batman's the first superhero who we know is squarely about criminal justice. There's that famous origin panel where he's thinking about what happened to his parents, and he says, "I swear by the spirits of my parents to avenge their deaths by spending the rest of my life warring on all criminals." Birth of Batman. Okay, very powerful stuff.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the origin of Hooded Justice, the first superhero in the Watchmen universe. Yeah. And if it interests you to contrast that to Batman and how Batman has played such a role in society.
Oh, this is a fun question. I really appreciate that. So I think the really important difference between two characters is that Batman does go after all criminals for all time, but I really like Diva's framing earlier about purpose. And in the end, as much as I have a kind of a personal affection for the character, there is something very glaringly empty about the character insofar that his purpose is vengeance based on, not to minimize the death of her parents, but based on a personal slight, right? Nothing about what happens to him stands in for anything broader about society, except that there are bad people in the world. Hooded Justice comes into being when the police drag him off, and first of all, when he's slighted at the ceremony where he becomes an officer, and he's passed right over, and he has to wait for the black officer to give him his badge. And then as he tries to do justice, he watches this guy commit an act of anti-Semitism, right, and bomb this delicatessen. And then when he's dragged off, Hooded Justice just isn't a victim in the miniature. He's a stand-in for all of it, right? I mean, he's a stand-in for all of it, for all of white supremacy, for a few centuries of abuse of black bodies and disparagement and being rendered invisible and questioned, and for all of it, right? And Hooded Justice's story becomes that much more powerful because vis-a-vis a character like Batman, his purpose is righteous in a way Batman's never really could be, right? Now, we could have debates about methodology of each and both, but it's interesting to note that by the same token, his purpose, even though no one understands what his purpose really is, gives rise to a whole industry, right? And no one knows that Hooded Justice is in the end black except for Captain Metropolis, right? So there's that. But I want to also just introduce another juxtaposition, and that is the very powerful moment in episode 6 where he's on foot patrol and he walks up to the newspaper stand and he's making small talk, and episode 1 of Action Comics is in the guy's hand, and he says, "What's this about?" He says, "Some guy escapes a planet, right, and goes." And I get like goosebumps just thinking about that, right? Because the powerful metaphor that Hooded Justice is, this is his future, right? As a black man in a white police force in the early part of 20th century, and there's no other heroes around, this is his destiny to a certain degree, right? To land on this world and try to do justice, but also a kind of a meta metaphor, as if to say, Black people in general have been landed here, rendered to some extent homeless, right? And must figure out what it means to live in a society whose values need addressing, right? And so I think, there's a Batman versus Superman mythos in the comics, and I think Hooded Justice is kind of inserted into this as a kind of a mediator, giving Batman a certain kind of, value that Batman himself doesn't have, but also rendering Superman's story less fantastic and really visceral and immediate just by observing American history and in the diaspora.
Lee, I see that you wanted to. Thank you so much, Chris. I know you're a fan of the character too. Both characters. So.
Yeah.
So I was reading through a couple of things, and one of the things that came up was that the original creator of Watchmen, there's this video going around of him, very, very old video of him saying that these old kind of like movies from the 1920s, like Birth of a Nation, are the first superhero movies, and it's not meant in a nice way, not in the slightest, and that Damon Lindelof actually took that and used it as fodder for really exploring and exploding the mythology around superheroes. And so when I think we look at this, part of what I see is that Hooded Justice is not a superhero. And I don't think that he intends to be a superhero. He's, a self-described angry Black man who wants to do something and realizes that he has to cover his face in order to express that rage, right? So even though we see it, we, the audience, acknowledge that it is righteous rage, in that moment, it's simply seen as rage. And I think a lot about how we talk about, say, for example, people who engage in urban rebellion and rioting and things like that, we say it's uncontrollable, it's ressentiment, it's resentment, it's dangerous because it's so, it's so powerful. But in fact, I think that's turning this entire narrative on its head, right? So vigilante justice in this case, which largely has been used when we think about, say, extra legal violence like lynching, here's Hooded Justice saying, no, actually, this is a way for me to express the rage that I cannot, express. And this is the same, we're talking about not just his experience in that moment where he's nearly lynched, but also the experience of the Tulsa race riots, right? That is his formidable memory. This is how he meets his wife because he saves her life. Right. So I think part of what we have to explore, too, is how this idea of vigilante justice told through the tale of a Black man is incredibly powerful and upends kind of this space. The other thing I'll say here, too, is that, when we look at Hooded Justice story, he tried to do it, quote unquote, the right way. Right? He goes through the police force, only to find out that the police force, in ways that are, I don't know if Damon Lindelof read this, the FBI report about how policing has been infiltrated by white nationalists, but only to find out that justice and the law has been infiltrated by white nationalists. So he has to go to another direction. One thing that I'll end here is by saying that when he decides to take up Captain Metropolis's offer to start this kind of superhero group, that's when we see the painting on of the whiteness underneath. We see that when Hooded Justice says, there's a white supremacist plot, we have to focus on this. Captain Metropolis says, well, no, that's not good PR. That's not good. That's not what we do. And I think there's also something important, too, about the fact that they are having a relationship. They're having really two men are having a relationship. And it's something else that Hooded Justice very much feels like he can't be open about, right? So there's a repression in both his Blackness and his sexuality that's happening once he becomes a superhero. And I think part of this is to remind us that there are no superheroes, right? So it's the moment when he becomes a superhero that Hooded Justice's like actual power is watered down.
Diva, did you want to? This is great. You're great, Diva. Did you want to jump in as well?
Yeah, just to sort of build on that, for me, it's a critique of superheroes and policing and police, right? In general, right? Like, so several times in the series, there's a critique of mask wearing, right? Like, Laurie Blake has turned against it, in the end, Will Reeves says you can't heal under a mask, right? These problems need air, right? Which is an interesting sort of link up to what you, Chris, and Leah have been saying about Dr. Manhattan and why he had to be in a Black body, right? Like that, it needs air. We have to go through this journey, this process, this transformation through feeling this, right? To put it under a mask is not going to get us where we need to be. And I have to say, I mean, I know we haven't quite gotten there yet, but on the question of police and policing, I think it's very keen. And I don't think that it's only about the police being infiltrated by white nationalists, which of course the 7th Cavalry are explicitly white nationalists, but also that it's not clear to me that the police are against white supremacy. I think the police are against getting murdered, right? Like, I think they're against the other team that has come for them, and it's not so clear. It's not so clear that they're a force for good per se. And there's that scene in the, I don't know, maybe the 2nd episode where they do a raid on the 7th Cavalry, and Angela is telling them, like, why are you just doing wanton destruction, right? And they're just like ready to go, right, against the other team. I think it's very, I think it has a lot to say about the ways that white supremacy is insidious and infiltrates all of our institutions, but also just on the question of policing itself. The fact that they're masked, of course, to protect their identities because of the white knight, but also, as Ozymandias says on Europa, masks make men cruel.
Yeah, I think this is a great time then to pivot to this question that we've been moving towards, which is, what is the Watchmen television series trying to get us to think about when it comes to policing? I know that many of us, and Chris, you and I had mentioned this a little bit in the podcast. When we first heard, I'll speak for myself, when I first heard there's a new Watchmen series coming out, oh, and by the way, it's all going to be about, police and the superheroes are going to be members of the police, I was like, pass. It just seemed to invite, like, this is not going to go well. Obviously we wouldn't be here if we didn't think that there was a tremendous amount to learn from it. But I have a lot of trouble still trying to wrap my head around what the series is trying to get us to think about policing. So that's a question to anyone who'd like to start us off, so we can dwell on it a little bit. Where do we want to begin with this?
Well, Diva, since you kind of got to introduce the topic, why don't you take the first kind of pass at it?
I'm actually happy for you to go first, but I read it as because I'm reading it through the lens of the work that I'm doing right now. I read it really as an abolitionist text. I didn't think that the police were redeemable, really, insofar as Laurie Blake and Looking Glass changed. I don't think that they changed the institution. I think they changed as individuals, and the institution itself was not shown in the most flattering light. Like I said, there was like they were wantonly violent. They seemed not to be grounded in any kind of respect for justice. They seemed incidentally against white supremacists, right? The 7th Cavalry was an enemy because they had murdered police, not necessarily because they were white supremacists. And a valid white nationalist had infiltrated them at every level. So I didn't feel like it was a story of redemption for police or policing. Although that desire was there, obviously, through 3 generations of Angela's family, right? Like, they wanted to trust in the law, right? Like, as Bass Reeves said, but they ultimately found that they could not.
Leah, do you want to take the next crack, or?
Sure.
Me and Dave have been having a little debate about this, but
So, one of the things that I've been struggling through in my own work is the way in which African Americans, Black people in this country, have been most, I guess, marginalized from the process of democracy and justice, and yet still maintain or still act as democracy's biggest defenders. Right. So we can go back and we can trace this longer history where African Americans, say, we're treating it justly, but let's move towards patriotism. We've been treated, Tulsa massacre, but let's move towards law enforcement as a way of, engaging this. Or let's protest in the streets because protests will make us a better democratic nation. So even in the face of repeated and continuing injustice and the failures of the state, African Americans have been committed to this project of democracy, even though they've been excluded from it. And so part of what it felt like is Watchmen doing that work, right? And maybe it's me, again, projecting my own research onto it and my own project onto it. But one of the things that we see over and over and over again is that these various institutions, whether it be superheroes, whether it be the police, have failed Black people over and over and over again, right? And there's that, again, that critique, I think, of Looking Glass, right? Even at his best, he ends up failing Angela, to whom he's closest with, right? And so I think I don't actually read this as an endorsement of, police or an endorsement of the institution of policing. I think I read this as a critique, a really longer critique, but then also there's something complex about the way in which, somebody like Angela uses the police and moves to the police, even when she finds that her mentor, right, Judd, is a white supremacist, that, the senator who's been working with them is a white supremacist, right? Like that the core is rotten, but there's still something about the way that she keeps reaching towards it, the way that, say, Will Reeves reaches towards it, the way that various characters in the show reach towards it. And yet it continues to fail them. So I think this is a larger critique, but also in typical kind of Damon Lindelof fashion, it's left ambiguous in a lot of places and open for interpretation.
In my own view, and and me and Dave have actually been having a conversation about this, and I'm persuaded by the point she makes. I do think there are a couple of, I've tended to have the view that I don't think the show is endorsing the police. On my first viewing of the show, I thought that the police being explicitly anti-racist was something that was meant to possibly redeem the institution. I'm not sure I believe that quite anymore, but I think there are two things internal to the show that are important. One is that I'm not quite sure that they are incidentally against anti-racism, because one of the really provocative things about the show is that the whole nation has become anti-racist, right? The idea of Redfordations, right? The fact that, this language is just kind of pervasive, throughout the whole society. So it seems we get that intimation from the very idea of Redfordations, and how much, right, so many white people in the show hate Redfordations, right? And that one idea as a stand-in for maybe an anti-racist nation suggests to me that then the police are actually a component of that kind of change in the American soul, if that's what's happening by the idea of Redfordations. The other thing I think is happening is the very real history inside the show and outside the show about how violent white supremacists have been historically, right? And so then when I took those two things together, the police are violent in the show, but when the police are saying, "Take this, you racist bleep," right? I took that to be in some sense genuine, not merely we're going to go crack some skulls, whoever the bad guys are, right? And so when I saw them, I'm a person who has a slight affinity for justice as vengeance. What I saw the show in some sense doing was really turning the tables. If violence is the language of racists, then language will be the violence will be the language of anti-racist. And if that's how we're going to do it, we're going to send the most powerful team using that language against this historical plague of white supremacy. That's how I tend to view it. Now, do I endorse, that kind of policing generally? But inside the show, it seemed to be a necessary response to not only the 7th Cavalry and Micro, but to what history the 7th Cavalry was bringing with them. That's a history of murder, rape, exploitation, right, and abuse. And you're not going to get that by just kind of walking in and saying, "Hey, everybody, can you point us to where the 7th Cavalry is?" Right? So, I think I had a slightly more forgiving attitude of how the police were portrayed, but I don't think that means they're redeemed. The real interesting question to the show would be, if there was a second season, I really hope there isn't, what do the police now look like when the last big enemy is gone? And if they proceed as they had been, then Diva's absolutely right, and Lee's absolutely right. This is really a big critique of the police generally to a certain extent, right? But if they actually, in some sense, you can imagine they defund, right? Because Seventh Cavalry is gone, and that was the last big enemy. A Black woman is God. Everybody go home. All right, it's all done. And so that would be a really interesting question for a second season. But that's how I tend to view in general the police in the show. Yeah.
I'm going to be turning this shortly to some questions from the folks that are listening. But Diva or Leah, did you want to continue this a little bit first? Or?
Yeah. So I just have a quick question, and I think for Diva and Chris. But if a Black woman is God, why do you need the police?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And nice. So, I mean, it's an interesting, it's an interesting theoretical. I mean, and there's
he was dying over here.
there's, I mean, this is what, Black Southerners on New Ground. This is what, Asada's girls, I think, and a lot of these abolitionist groups have essentially been saying about these, these grassroots movements, about community policing, about defund the police. Why do we need police when we have these other institutions that we should be investing in and we should be pouring funding and we should be pouring support into these efforts? So, I mean, to me, that's the real, existential question, which is why do you need police when a Black woman is God?
Yeah, and real quickly, the brilliant part about your point, Leah, is that it reaffirms Diva's point that in some way Watchmen is a Black feminist text, right? Because if you extrapolate your point, the ultimate point is if you have the care and strength of Black matriarchy to guide values, then these institutions that are overwrought in so many ways are just deemed unnecessary and actually maybe counterproductive. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump back in, but I just thought those 2 points together were so brilliant.
Diva, do you want to jump in here before we turn it over to some questions from folks?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I would add is that I think that I don't think that Angela, receiving her godhead is really like the end of the story, right? I think that part of the meaning that it's not as though then everything is solved, right? I think that then you have a chance. Just a chance, right? You have an opportunity to work through things in a different way because of her purpose and because of the way that she's anchored by love and family and checking for other people, by care, really. You have a chance to work through things in a different way, but I don't think that it is, guaranteed, right? Like, and I hear you, Chris, about what we might imply about the wider nation, particularly with the evidence of retrogradations, right? Like that there has been an attempt to sort of pay what is owed, right? As Nicole Hannah-Jones has just written in the New York Times. If you haven't read it, read it. But so that is a good point. So maybe it'll be a more fertile ground for Angela as Manhattan to enter into. But either way, it's a process, it's a journey, right? Like that's what Looking Glass teaches us, right? Like that this is not easy. You don't make the right decision right away, right? You have to like work through it and move through it. But for me, that's very hopeful. Me, philosophically, I'm a pragmatist, so I believe iterations are the only true way to go. So for me, it gave me a very warm and fuzzy feeling to have the opportunity to go in the right direction at the end of the show.
So the first question coming from folks who are listening in is relevant to our conversation here, and it's really an invitation to expand upon a character who we haven't talked about much, and that's because we've been focused on so many of the heroes of this show. We haven't talked about some of the villains, at least not in great detail. And so there's an invitation by Fernando, who says, let's talk a little bit about Joe Keene, the double-faced politician that's sympathetic with the Black cops, but in the end is the head of the 7th Cavalry and trying to steal Manhattan's power. So there's an invitation for many of you. What is the show asking us to? What is the show telling us about Joe Keene? I mean, is Joe Keene just supposed to be an archetype, or is there something else going on there?
Personally, and this is no disrespect to Fernando, I think this is kind of the show's point. I think he's just not very interesting. I think he's boring in his. I think his evil is banal. I think his ambitions are boring. They're grand, but artificially grand. His big idea is steal the power from somebody else, right? That's the grand plan, right? Right? And it shows a complete lack of. This guy is like the least imaginative white supremacist on the planet, right? I mean, and so I think I think in some ways, I think that's the show, and that's the role he's meant to play. Like, look at this guy with, this authority. He's young, he's a senator, and his big skill is, a smile of gold, and wait to get somebody else's mojo, and then he'll use it for himself. Like, this is his big plan. And so that's really all I have to say about Joaquin. Like, I think in many ways, I think the show wanted to make him substantively not especially interesting as a critique of, right, racism. Obviously racism is murderous and, right, rapist and exploitative, but also to certain, in a very particular way, it's also really damn boring. Like, really, your big idea is just to hate me because of the color of my skin. Like, that's the grand idea behind all of this. And I think that's kind of wrapped up in Joaquin, but that's just my very kind of quick take on that guy.
All right, Leah or Diva?
So I'll just say very quickly, I agree. I think with Chris that Joaquin is really boring. He's and I don't think that is accidental. I think that is a deliberate decision by the show writers and the show runners, and to make him in that way. The one thing that I'll add here is that he's charming.
Right, yeah.
Very charming. He's good looking. He's tall. He's polished. Right. He is about as stereotypical as a politician as you can get. Very Joe Kennedy. Right. Yeah. But I think it's so interesting that the first episode where we see, like, with Laurie Blake, is there's this intersection between Keen and Laurie where she's clearly bored by him. Right. So it sets up this dynamic, like, here's this guy who's like, I'm going to be the next president and I'll give you what you want. And at this point, we don't know that he's the leader of the 7th Cavalry and, white supremacists, but we do know that he's boring and that he's not very interesting or very intriguing. So there are moments, I think, too, later on in the show, like when Angela saves his life and things like that, we're not necessarily invested. We're like, wow, but we're invested because Angela, did this huge thing, but not because Joaquin was saved. So when he reveals himself as this great villain, I think everyone kind of was like, yep, he's the villain. There you go. And this is your great plan. You're stealing things. You're going to steal and become a blue man, and that's it. All right.
It's like a Scooby-Doo plot.
Right. But I think that is part of the point, which is that so much of this, so much of this violence, so much of white supremacy is boring in its predictability, right? Like try something else. I don't know. So that's where I land.
The banality of evil, right?
Yeah. That's our end, right? The banality of evil. David, do you want to jump? I personally, I'll just say this is meta. I couldn't stop seeing him as Bob from Mad Men. The whole show, I just kept seeing him. I just kept someone saying, "How are things going?" "Not well, Bob." I think that became a meme. And really, things didn't go very well for Bob at the end. Diva, do you have any thoughts on the senator?
I think the more interesting villain than Joaquin were the white supremacists of the hooded justice era, who were trying to use mesmerism. I thought that was very, very interesting and super meta in terms of what white supremacy is and how it impacts everyone, not just white people. When the woman in the theater was saying, I heard a voice inside my head telling me to hate myself and hurt myself, right, and others, I was just like, well, I mean, that's a pretty fine metaphor. I mean, like, to put it right on the nose, right? Like, kind of like maybe a little bit too. So I thought that was really, really interesting. That it was a comment to me about what structural racism is, right, and why it kind of doesn't matter if the body who occupies a racist institution, what color that body is, right, because the institution itself is set up to create the conditions under which people will harm each other and themselves, right? Like, so I thought that was super profound, much more so than Scooby-Doo John Keene, who I agree, Laurie Blake had the perfect reaction to.
All right, so since we only have 10 minutes, we may not have time to get to as many of these as we want, but there's a question early on that it's a great way to sort of to invite us to think a little bit bigger. So this is from A. David Lewis. Early on, he's asking us to reflect on the original Watchmen story, and he points out that there was a dearth of Black characters in the original Watchmen, and now Leah's point, of course, that Alan Moore comes in and says, the birth of the superhero is birth of the nation, And that was not a compliment. And we know that the original Watchmen is a complete indictment on superhero stories. You know, they're either sociopathic or they're disengaged or whatever. But so here comes the cool question. Like, what do we do now with this as a superhero narrative or a costume hero narrative? It gives us extremely strong Black heroes of different sorts. You want to put those, I'm going to invite you to put those into conversations with other Black superhero characters that you like. How does Hooded Justice fit into the pantheon? You know, how does Angela fit into the pantheon? Any thoughts on bringing them into the fold and comparing and contrasting with other representations of powerful Black superheroes?
Well, as you all know, I have like no thoughts on like Black Panther.
I was
but-
waiting, Chris. I was like, come on, I couldn't have set this up better.
I know you set him up and I'll knock him down. I just have a very brief thing to say because we're running out of time. And that is what's interesting in terms of the representation. You know, here you have T'Challa as just backed by the most incredible, vast resources of wealth and power in the world. And it takes him coming to America to kind of get it, right? And looking around and saying, oh, wow, like racial like injustice is something that's happening in the world outside of us, which is of course what his early family member was trying to fight against. And Hooded Justice, I mean, his power, as Diva and Leah pointed out, I mean, just rage, right? And so I think I think one of the things to take away from Hooded Justice vis-a-vis the pantheon of Black heroes is that this is just a guy who has only two things, not only, but two important things: his rage and a sense of history. And I think, you know, Leah's point earlier that, you know, his story begins on a burning field in a burning city, and that's where he meets his wife. These two things alone give him a sense of purpose. And these, in some sense, are his powers. And it grounds the hero story in such a way that we're not talking about fighting the supervillains, we're talking about just fighting inner demons and those of people who have fewer scruples. But that's all I'll say.
Diva or Leah?
So I'll say just a couple of things. One, I think Watchmen again invites us to critique the superhero model, and I think that's actually really important for thinking about Black superheroes. And you know, they run the gamut, but the one, to Chris's point, the one that we all know right now is, you know, Black Panther. And there's this kind of you know, studiousness or earnestness about this idea of the Black superhero. And what's so exciting about Watchmen is that they give us Black heroes who are not perfect, and Black heroes who are righteous and have this longer sense of history. I mean, talk about origin stories, but, you know, who have this longer sense of history and kind of trauma, but who are working through this and don't imagine themselves as heroes. And I think that's actually a great counter narrative to all of these kind of conversations around Black excellence, Black respectability, right? Black performative action in the service of equality, because we know that those things don't work, right? So this is actually, you know, it's an interesting contrast to some of the Black superheroes that we've seen to actually put these individuals in the canon. And then the last thing that I'll say is, I absolutely love the fact that the Black, you know, the story ends with, and really in some ways begins, but really ends with a Black woman being the superhero or the anti-hero that we need. And that the nation essentially says, this is the hero that we need, this is the hero that we have, and this is the hero who with ideas of possibility for equality, and who certainly has the purpose, who has the history, who has the origin story, and then now has the power to actually do something.
Diva?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I'm always checking for the women. So for me, even in the story of Black Panther, the hero that stands out in that story to me is Okoye, who is the head of the Dora Milaje. And that's really because of her relationships, right? Like the way that she's connected to the other parts of the story. And I think that Angela has the same kinds of connections. And so for me, you know, I think it's a comment on what we should regard as heroic, right? Like what are the things that constitute heroism. And for me also, right, like most of what I read, right, in terms of like fiction and fantasy is like strong female lead, like warrior teams, like stuff, right? And it's because of the relationships and the connections, and the thing that makes these heroes strong is that they are always trying to be in right relationship with their team, and trying to bring right relationships to the world. And so I think it's a kind of different take on what it means to be heroic. It's not just about being a kind of Herculean figure who is possessed with all this power, but it's also really about how we are relating to other people. And those are the things that both make us vulnerable and make us strong.
One last question, which we only have a few minutes. So it's probably a totally unfair question. But all the same, I think it's good to get it out there, even if we just begin the conversation around it. So what struck me about the original Watchmen series was its really cynical conclusion. It has a stance on humanity, and it's not a great stance. And the stance is the only way for humans to keep themselves from blowing each other up, in the context of the original Watchmen, is to live in fear of some other coming in. It's the only way that we're going to save ourselves. And so, what I'm inviting you all to do is to tell me your thoughts on what you think the take on the Watchmen series is about humanity. Is it as cynical a take? Is it more hopeful? Is that hopefulness deserved, or is it too fantastical? We leave the original Watchmen having a view of what humanity is like. It's not a great one. What does this series invite us to view humanity as? And I'm happy for anyone to jump in first. And we'll wrap up in like 3 minutes. So. Leah or Diva, do you want to start, get the ball rolling on this one?
I'll just say that I'm deeply optimistic about the ending of the show, and but also the fact that the show is centered around Angela Akbar. Like there is a way that you can read the show, and there are lots of different ways to read the show, but you can really read it as Angela's life, her history, her future, her possibility. And that to me was really rich, and added another element where it would have been very easy to be distracted or to be hyper-focused on the fact that, like, even in an age where we have red furations and where there's this giant, squid attack on New York City, like organized squid attack on New York City, to be very cynical about that, but to say instead, the focus is on this Black woman and her path. And to me, that is deeply optimistic. That is really, really optimistic, right? Particularly in contrast to the fact that, like, the institutions of America have been infiltrated by white supremacists, even in an age where we're supposed to be anti-racist. So I see it as a very different rendering and different reading of the original, right, cynical comic. The cynicism is still there, but there is certainly a note of optimism that travels through the body and the lived experience of Angela Akbar.
Thank you, Leah. Chris or Diva, or final thoughts on that?
I see Diva's like, she has that master thought coming, so I'm gonna give her some more time to cook it. That's what it looks like. I want to just add to Leah's already, great comment that, one of the central themes in Black thought historically has been, why should Black folks have faith in the American project? And part of the optimism in the ending of the show is that in the end, for whatever else it was worth, Angela's life and, and the whole experience, right? It was all worth it. It all ended in something in which there was a kind of really substantive payoff in terms of power, and also the symbology of this Black woman gaining this great power, right? And I want to suggest that, at least internal to the show, it does seem to want to push viewers, saying, listen, there could be an other side to this. And last, real quick, that ending is also a nullification of the more cynical ending in a very particular way, because as you use very interesting language, Chris, that the thesis of the printed comic, the first run, was we can all come together if there's an other. But that boundary is very fluid, right? So we're all of humanity is the us now, and the other is the aliens. But what about when we realize the aliens go away, then the other becomes Black people again, right? And what this ending of this show seems to suggest is we don't need an other for unity. We actually just need the idea of getting right with the principles that we all seem to be claiming. That's what I'll leave on there.
Thanks, Chris. Diva?
Yeah, something that you said, Chris, really made me think about a moment in the show where Ozymandias is talking to Manhattan, who comes back to him, and Ozymandias says to Manhattan, "I asked you at the time, right after he like caused this massacre where 3 million people died, was it all worth it in the end?" And you said, "So that you could avoid my question, nothing ever ends." And to me, I think that that's the way that the series turns the printed comic on its head, because it's sort of is saying that you still have a chance. You have a chance to do better. You have a chance to make a different set of choices. We have a chance to arrange power in a different way. We can choose something else. And then the two cop characters at the end also say, talk about change, right? And changing themselves. So I think it's very optimistic. I think it pulls no punches in terms of what its view of like humanity as it is, is. But it wants us to imagine beyond fear, right? Like Laurie Blake says that in the end when Ozymandias is like, "If you put me away, the world will end." And Laurie says, "People keep saying that, but the world keeps not ending. So maybe we should try to do the right thing, So I feel like that's...
She punches him, doesn't she?
Yeah, she does. Yeah, so I think that's what it is. It's like it's not over. So if it's not over, then we can make a different set of choices, right? And arrange power in a different way and see where we come out. There's no guarantees, right? The world might end, but it might not.
Been waiting a long time for someone to punch Ozymandias. It's like a long time in the coming for what he did. Diva Woodley, Lee Wright-Rigueur, Chris LeBron. Oh my goodness, what a great conversation. Thank you so much for participating. For folks listening, if you don't mind sticking around here for 1 second, we'll be shutting down there soon. But everyone who tuned in, thank you so much again for participating. I hope this gave you plenty of food for thought. Go watch Watchmen, and please, please, please also read the fine scholarship that these three scholars have produced and will continue to produce. It's essential reading. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.